Can you do a mic check for me?
Got it? Can you hear this?
Yeah.
Good enough?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Hi, and welcome to the next session of our tiny house workshops. Right now we're going to hear the impact of living tiny and designing tiny. We want to thank our sponsors, Whole Foods, Hannah Solar, the City of Decatur, and Fontes Water. You got everybody in and settled? Let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. Dan Lachey founded Tiny Home Builders in 2009. At that time, Dan's mother was in need of a new home but had limited financial resources. A tiny house proved to be the answer by providing a high-quality house for less than the cost of most cars. Because of the overwhelming response from the design, they began selling the plans and a guide to assist others who wanted to do it themselves. A short time later, they began building custom tiny houses. They currently provide guidance and support to people making the transition to tiny living all over the world. Brian Sweeney possesses a trio of SCAD degrees, a BFA in Historic Preservation, a BFA in Interior Design, and a Master of Architecture. Interior Design Professor Brian Sweeney puts all three disciplines into practice at his Decatur, Georgia-based design firm, Sweeney Design. Prior to joining the faculty of SCAD Atlanta, Sweeney served as project architect and designer on numerous high-level award-winning projects. He led designs of the CDC's Global Health Communications Building. Good job on that. The restoration of the New York Public Library main reading room, and the adaptive reuse of the old birdhouse at the Bronx Zoo. Brian's class of 2013 was one of the original teams to start designing the SCAD pad, which we'll hear more about. His work has been featured in the New York Magazine, Ascent Magazine, Interior Magazine, and others. And he was honored with the Gold Award for Outstanding Design Excellence from the Georgia American Society of Interior Designs in 2000. So we've got a couple of serious experts, and we're going to turn it over to them.
Thank you, Linda. I see the formatting of my slide got a little lost.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Hopefully we'll be able to read it all. Thank you everybody for coming. I see you guys have figured out where the air conditioning is. You're the smart ones. Everyone else is out there baking in the sun. So today we're going to talk about the impact of tiny houses on individuals and communities. Now for those of you who are very familiar with the tiny house movement, some of this is going to be old news to you, but there's a lot of people here that are kind of new, and they understand that there are some benefits, but they may not have a full grasp of all of the benefits. So to figure out the impact of tiny houses, we don't have to look much further than understanding why tiny houses are so popular. You're at an event today that 5 years ago, the industry didn't even hardly exist. And now all of a sudden we have 3,000 people showing up each day just to step foot, sitting in the sun, waiting in lines, just to step foot in a tiny house. And that's pretty amazing. It's just, the industry is just completely blown up. And so why is that? Why is everybody here? And a lot of that has to do with tiny houses fill a void in the current housing market. There's also a part of it where tiny houses are just really cool to look at, but for a lot of people, this is something that's answering and solving a problem that they have. And so what is that problem? Like where's the void? What does that mean? So right now, if you get out of school or if you're get out of college and you're one of the 45% that actually don't move back in with their parents, you're looking at basically two predominant options. One is buying usually a single family home, or going off and renting an apartment, perhaps, or a townhome. And each of these options have their downfalls. They're not without their faults. So if you're buying, a big problem is the expense of buying. Especially if you want to live where other people want to live. If you want to live at, I just like to throw this thing every once in a while. Reminds me how much I wave my hands around when I talk. Especially if you want to live someplace where other people want to live, housing prices are really, really high. And that kind of goes along with this last one that I'll get to too, but it's just really expensive to own a home anymore. Regular housing is also pretty inflexible. And what that means is that I recently read an article about an accountant who is an accountant for millennials, and he says a big part of his job is convincing millennials not to buy a house. And it goes into detail as to why that is, and a lot of it comes down to it's just not flexible. If you're going to buy a house, you typically have to live in that house for about 10 years just to break even on it. And so if you're younger and your business opportunities and career opportunities are coming up, if you buy into a house, it kind of locks you into an area or a specific place for 10 years at least. And so he's saying, you're not going to make the money that people used to make, and you're going to be locked in, so this may not be the best option for you. In fact, it's probably not the best option for you. So traditional housing is pretty inflexible. Then also, traditional housing is probably larger than needed for most. And this is the result of builders. If you look at the average square foot of a house over the last 3 decades, it's consistently gone up, except when the housing crisis happened, there was a little bit of a dip down, and then it went back up. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of, when you're doing a development or when you're building a house, there's a lot of fixed costs that go into that house. And square footage, the size of the house, is the variable cost. But that's a pretty small fraction of it, especially when you're talking about empty space. So, a developer comes in, he has to install the roads no matter what size the houses are. They have to bring in builders and bring in all the materials no matter what size the house it is. So but houses are charged by the square foot. So it's, if you're a builder, it's very easy to add on an extra 10 square feet because you're going to get that extra money, and it's not very expensive. So houses just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, regardless if you really want it or need it. So you say, okay, well I see the problems there. Well, why don't you just rent? Rent solves this inflexibility problem because you can, it's easy to move when you rent, but renting has its own set of problems. So let's start with price insecurity. When you're renting a house or renting an apartment, at the end of your 1-year lease, what do? They raise the price. And you know why they do that? Not necessarily because that's what the market bears, because they're figuring, your threshold of pain. How much is it going to take that you're not going to move? If we raise your rent $50, you're probably not going to go through the hassle and the expense of moving to a new house. You're just going to put up with it. And then the next year, it's another $50. And the next year, it's $75. Until eventually you're forced to move. So when you rent, there's just this constant, you never know when they're going to just force you out. And that's not a very comfortable feeling. Rental property typically has a higher crime rate. And that's just because people, when they don't own, they don't have as strong of a sense of community. And that's not just apartments, but that's also housing areas or traditional neighborhoods as well. And so people sometimes don't want to live in an area where there's a higher crime, or all the time, pretty much. No one's saying, where's the highest crime? That's where I want to live. And no sense of ownership. I kind of touched on that earlier, but not that you're making money necessarily when you buy a house, but it feels pretty bad when you're renting and that when you buy a home, there's a possibility that it could appreciate, especially if you're going to stay there a long time. But with renting, there's just no chance of that. So it's not a very good feeling either. You don't, when you write that rent check, it's not fun to know that it's never going to come back. So then all of a sudden, tiny houses come along. And for a lot of people, this kind of, fills or solves a lot of these problems. So tiny houses are relatively inexpensive. Now, on a tiny house, it's often you'll see that the average square footage, the price of a square foot is higher than on a house because the ratio of bathrooms to kitchen to the total square footage is higher. But because they're smaller, they're a lot less money. So if a tiny house is $40,000, and in an area the housing is typically $400,000, the house may be 1/10 the size, and so it's 1/10 the price. But for people that are not as interested in the large houses, that's a trade-off that a lot of people are willing to make. It's usually you just can't find the house size that you want. You're willing to pay the same square footage, you're willing to pay for it, you just can't find it because the developers don't want it. Then also tiny houses have the flexibility, especially if they're on wheels. Now, this doesn't apply for a tiny house on a foundation, but if you have a job in Atlanta and an opportunity comes up in Orlando, and you find the exact same house with the exact same price in Orlando or in another city, you have to sell this house, there's costs that go along with that, there's the costs that go along with your closing costs of buying a new house, so that transition costs a lot of money. Whereas with a tiny house on wheels, if you can find parking for it, then it's just a matter of moving the house. It just seems counterintuitive that you could find the exact same house and still have to pay $30,000, $35,000 out of your pocket. Then finally, tiny houses are an owned asset. When you look at how much you pay in rent, if you're paying $1,500 in rent, you could buy most tiny houses if you don't factor in the land that you might be paying the rent to put the tiny house on. You can buy a lot of tiny houses in just 2 years, and that if it's built well, that's not going to depreciate that much over the course of however long you're going to live in it. If you're going to live in it for 3 or 4 years, you're still going to have a pretty good asset at the end of that you can make, you can recover some of that money on. Perhaps even more than a traditional house on the short term. So a tiny house might depreciate, whereas a real house might appreciate, but because of the cost associated with a real house, that appreciation has to appreciate a lot to overcome those. So this has become, this is a solution for a lot of people, and it's made people really excited. Tiny houses is, as you can see when you go outside, people are getting very excited about that. So there's other benefits as well that I didn't touch on. Besides the flexibility and the pricing, there's some other benefits. And before I touch on those, I want to tell you a story about my mom. This is the very first house that we built. This is the house that my mom lived in for 6 years. She was living in a mobile home down in Florida, and the mobile home got hit with a hurricane. And at that time, it started leaking a lot of water. She started having a lot of mold growth, and she said, what am I going to do? So we started researching options. I couldn't afford to buy her a new house. I didn't want to buy a new mobile home because I didn't want, at that time, hurricanes were hitting Florida every year. I didn't want to invest that money and then the next year have the exact same problems. So I was kind of stuck. I didn't know what my options were. Well, I happened to be watching PBS one day, and there was a story about this lady, Elizabeth Turnbull, who was going to grad school, and she looked at how much the housing was going to cost her while she was in grad school, and the housing was as much as it would cost her to build her own tiny house. And when I saw that, I was like, man, this is something. This is something that I could do for my mom. I was living up in Atlanta at the time. She was living down in Florida, so I built it up here in my driveway. My HOA was not very happy about that. But we ended up building it here and moving it down her, and she lived in it for 6 years. And what made me get into this, what changed my mind or really solidified this idea for me was my wife at the time that I was building it. She never said it, but I'm pretty certain that she thought I was a little crazy. Here she's like, who did I marry? I married a guy who's building a house in my driveway. And after it was done and we took it down to my mom, we went down and visited her. And when we went in there, and my wife saw how my mom was living, when we left there, we're driving in the car, and my wife was just so excited. She was like, I can't believe how viable this is. I see how happy your mom is. I see how much room it actually has. This is something that is a real thing that, she became a believer, and all of a sudden I was like, well, maybe I should do this for more people. So the reason I tell that story is my mom got into tiny houses because of the cost. She didn't have the money to buy a replacement home. That was what really drew her in. And for a lot of people, when as a business, we talk to hundreds of people a week, and for so many people, it's about the money. But then after they get into a tiny house, it becomes about so much more. So again, her thing was the cost of living or the cost of the house. But then after she got in it, she recognized there was a huge savings in the cost of actually living. So her bill, she was living in a mobile home, so her bills weren't very high, but the mobile home wasn't insulated very well. And so all of a sudden she got into a tiny house and her electric bill dropped down to $25 a month. Her cable bill was the same, obviously, certain fixed costs were the same, but everything dropped substantially. And all of a sudden she had a little bit more money to play with. It was environmentally friendly. My mom was not, I don't want the environmentalists to poo-poo my mom, but she wasn't doing this for the environmental impact. At that time, she was trying to solve her housing crisis, and so she was looking to save money. But when I talked to her about, how her consumption had changed, And all of a sudden, having less room for things, she was much more conscious about what she brought into her house. And that includes, how things are packaged in the store, how her food was packaged. So she got to the point to where she was only generating every week or two one grocery bag full of trash. It was a relatively small amount of trash compared to what she was generating before. And also just the fact that her bills were lower, she was using less resources. And then finally, simplicity. We get contacted a lot about this one. But she thought she had a pretty simple life. But when all of a sudden she was forced to think about what she was bringing into her house, she no longer wanted to kill time by going to Walmart. That was no longer an option. How many times have people I'll just go to Target to kill time. And the next thing you know, you're bringing home a quesadilla maker. That was not an option for her. She had to be very careful about what she bought. And because of that, all of a sudden she started to focus more on things that brought her enjoyment into life. Because if she's not going to waste her time, well, what am I going to spend my time on? And all of a sudden she started crafting a lot more and painting a lot more. She had been a painter before. And honestly, she's moved out. We moved her up here because of some health concerns. And she's living in a traditional house now, and all of her art has fallen off it. And I asked her, why are you doing it? And she said, just not, she's reverted, unfortunately, back to her old ways. So you don't need a tiny house to be simple, have a simpler life, but a tiny house enforces it. If you have the strength and the focus, you can attain a lot of these benefits without a tiny house. Tiny house is not a prerequisite for these, but they definitely force it upon you. And so I mentioned the simplicity. I kind of talk about that so much because it's definitely, when I talked to her afterwards, when she was living in that house, the money never came up. It was only unless I prodded her. But what she always talked about was that last thing, because it just brought her so much joy. So I think that's something that people kind of, it's almost like a silent weight that's on you. And you don't know it. You don't know it's gone until it's gone. And that was the case for my mom. All right, so I painted this rosy picture. What are the downsides? Obviously, there's not everything that's positive. Not everything is positive. And it used to be that there were 3 pretty strong downsides. And as popularity of tiny houses has grown, it's kind of come down to one. The financing has kind of fallen away a little bit. A lot of banks are financing. It's a lot easier to get insurance now. But the biggest thing is where legally park a tiny house. That's a pretty big concern, and that's why we're here today. The more awareness that we bring to this movement, and the more our officials see this and start thinking about it, the more likely this is going to be fixed. So this is definitely the biggest problem. But even when I'm out there yesterday and today, I'm talking to people, and people are actually successfully standing up communities. That's a far cry from how it was just a few years ago. All right, so tiny houses, the benefits that I've talked about so far are to the individual, but there's also benefits to the community. One of those benefits is keeping a younger population. If you grow up in an area, and when it's time to go off and get your own house, if there is no affordable housing option, you have no force but to leave. And there are towns that recognize this and are trying to change the housing specifically to keep those younger people in that a town needs to be healthy. There's a town in Spur, Texas. If you're followed the tiny house movement, I'm sure you've heard of this before, but it was a town. A lot of these rural Texas towns are kind of losing their population, and they're trying to figure out ways to keep that population there, not just the younger people, but all people, and bring people in. And so what they did was they said, we're going to welcome all tiny houses here. And I hadn't followed up with that for a little while, and recently I just wanted to see how they were doing. So I looked it up, and they have 60 tiny houses. And there was an article from the city planner that was very pleased with the turnout of that and how it was turning the town around, bringing in a lot of new talent. The article actually said, he was quoted as saying, we want more tiny houses, we just don't want nudists, which I thought that was very weird. Like, what experience did he have with a nudist that all of a sudden he was like, no more of that. But anyways, it keeps people in an area, or brings outside people in that you may want, artistic people that are, that can contribute to a community. The sense of ownership, when you have a community and people own that property, they have more of a sense, more of a tie to that community. They have more of a stake. They don't want to see the community go bad for various reasons, including their property values and just the fact that that's where they live and where they want to stay. Then also revitalizing neighborhoods. I've seen some communities that will perhaps put a tiny house community, a city will put it in an area that needs more people or needs, tiny house people are very hungry. And so they'll go to a lot of places. They're not necessarily as picky. So it can bring that help to areas that don't necessarily have it. All right, and that's it. No. Got the pad.
Dan? So Dan's firm actually, and builders actually helped with SCAD pad, helped with the structural bed that they're on, the trailers that they're sitting on. So what SCAD University was doing was we were looking at the micro housing unit, the tiny houses, and we took it to a micro level and addressed a lot of the same issues in what you're hearing, what you heard from Dan and what you see out in the exhibition area. And one of the biggest issues is parking. Where do you park it? Well, how about a parking structure? So with SCAD Atlanta and Savannah and our other campuses, the university took this idea of micro housing and we brought it to the university. And we thought, how can we use this as a teaching tool? And how can we use it to allow our students to learn, but at the same time, allow the community to learn? And when we talk about community, worldwide community. So we did what we call a charrette in 2013, and we brought primarily initially the disciplines we brought in were architecture, historic preservation, and interior design. And we quickly brought in sustainability, and by the time we were done, about a year later, we had 17 different majors involved with this. So interior, micro housing, tiny houses, is not just architecture, it's not just urban planning. The idea with us was, how can fine artists be involved? How can industrial design students be involved? How could gaming design be involved? So what we did, and the SCAD pad units are still on exhibit. We didn't bring them here, but we have them on permanent exhibit at SCAD Atlanta, which is right at 1600 HB Street. And here's a floor plan. So the concept was, let's park the tiny houses in parking spaces. So each SCAD pad is 8 feet by 16 feet, which is equal to the size of a parking space. Each unit has that interior space of 8 by 16, which is about 135 square feet. So we're talking tiny, we're talking micro housing. But what we also made sure we did, and this was part of the charrette and the learning process with our students, was the idea of indoor and outdoor space. So you have an enclosed interior space that's equal to a parking space, and then you have your own private garden that's also 8 by 16. So you have your own little private garden, and then on the corner there and other edges, we had the community space, the neighborhood. And we built these. We brought all these different disciplines in, and we asked a lot of questions. We came up with, I think, a lot of different solutions, and ultimately, we're still asking questions, and the purpose of this is an educational tool to talk about and to keep the conversation going and to expand upon it. I'd like to think of it that we're kind of dealing with the macro level and the micro level. So the macro level is that urban design concept, and then the micro component is the detailing, the fine art, the industrial design component. So here's some elevations and sections and plans, a little washed out with the lighting, but these are blueprints. And different architects, builders, and designers we're kind of limited. You're dealing with a small space, you're gonna have ultimately some of the same components that any house has. A small bathroom, a small kitchen, and a sleeping, living arrangement. So in terms of plan and even material, well, basically, really, in terms of plan, there's some interesting things associated with it, but what we expanded upon was more about what do you do with the interior, what are the materials and finishes that you apply to it, and the details, and the macro. How about you put it in a parking deck? Now, it's not a novelty. The idea is this is actually a urban planning issue worldwide. The younger generation, millennials in particular, don't buy cars as much. They don't drive as much as our older generation, my generation. I have a 16-year-old nephew, and his birthday is tomorrow, and he really couldn't care less if he's driving or not. We live in the age of Uber, Lyft, Zip cars, public transportation. So there's an urban infrastructure issue of parking structures not being used as much as they used to. And even when parking structures were being used, ultimately they're empty most of the time. Urban planners, city planners, they design for every car, there's about 5 parking spaces waiting for you to use that. It's kind of like, think about the mall. It's designed for Christmas, right? All those parking spaces are only designed for the day after Thanksgiving. So we're starting to see parking decks not being used, and we're starting to see parking decks being torn down and new buildings put up. So it became a historic preservation issue. How about you actually save the parking deck? You have a good structural frame, you have a roof overhead. So that allows not only that you have a place to park your tiny home, but the roofing construction could be a little less waterproofed compared to if it was sitting out and being exposed to the elements. And your outside space, you're not building a porch. Because I think, right here we have a lot of these just parked here, but ultimately I think what works very well with tiny homes is you walk outside, you have a deck, you have a covered porch. And then, so SCAD, we built 3 of them. We used inspiration for each. We used one of our campuses. So one is a North American theme, the one on the left is a European theme. So you see sunflowers, you see a copper roof that's mimicking the tiled roofs of Europe. And the designers went to work, and it took about a year, and we've had these built by students and on exhibit for about 2 years now. So this is the interior of the European unit, and flexibility is key, and the joyfulness is key to this as well. The idea is, living simple is what we're doing with these tiny homes. But living simple doesn't mean living plain. It doesn't mean living just with white walls and a bare floor. Living simple can mean, instead of hanging art, how about the interior and the exterior of the tiny house is art? So you're living in a piece of art. So the inspiration is fully around you. This is the toilet room for the European unit, and we had the gaming developers help us with this, and they actually work with the CDC. The CDC says that everybody should wash your hands for 30 seconds. Keep your hand with soap underneath the faucet. Well, CDC says most of us, especially children, don't do this. So our gaming development team went to work, and they created an automatic faucet, and you can't see it, but the mirror has a TV screen behind it, and it was a game. And as you put your hand under the faucet and wash your hands, you would see an animal climb up a tree, and the longer you held your hand under the water, the longer the animal got to the top and you got the fruit, and you were done washing your hands. So again, this is how we got, 17 plus disciplines involved to add an aspect of joyfulness and playfulness to our tiny homes. So this is one of the students. We had students, faculty, and community leaders live in them for a short period of time. We were able to have people live in them for just about 3 months. And, permitting was an issue. I think we had a camping permit. And we had students who took advantage of living in there. It worked perfectly as a dorm. I lived in one for about a week. And this is where it gets to the micro, I guess. It changes your behavior living in a tiny house. For myself, it was brushing my teeth and hearing the water pump going. When I brush my teeth or run water at my small home now, which is 1955 for ranch, 900 square feet, not tiny, but reasonable home, I don't hear the water pumping. But in the tiny home, I heard the water pumping, and I knew my neighbors could hear the water pumping. And it was kind of like a peer pressure of, oh, I gotta save some water. And when I'm brushing my teeth, I can turn the water off and then turn the water back on to rinse. Little things like that change our behavior, just like Dan's mom. You're very aware of the food that you bring in, the packaging that you bring in, because you have to throw it out, you have to store it, you have to carry your own garbage out and store it neatly underneath the counter. Here's some more pictures of the interiors. So, simplicity is that there's a Mercedes ad out right now, which is, I think it says, live everything, only the best or nothing. So I think in a way, what the students were doing with the SCAD pad was this idea of doing things ultimately as well as we could. We used technology. In this picture, you see some horizontal lines and some shelving units. The shelving units are 3D printed. So the idea here was come with not too much and you discover what you might need. And let's say you needed a comb. We had 3D printers in the little neighborhood section. So you could walk over to the 3D printer, program it, and you could print the comb. And then those shelves that are right there, they were actually 3D printed. So there was customization for the users in each of the different homes. So here's a little shot of one of those private garden spaces. And what happened is, most of us, when you live in your community, you're part of the community. As soon as you get into a car, you kind of feel like you're shielded and you're isolated. So what we were doing here was totally transforming the idea of being isolated inside a car to turning parking decks, parking spaces into community spaces. So as I lived here, I would come out and have breakfast or just kind of hang out in the side yard. But ultimately, I got to know my neighbors. One of the neighbors was another faculty member in gaming development, David Spencer. I had seen him for probably 6 years, just walking here and there through the building, but I never met him, never knew his name. But living here for just a week, I got to know a lot more about him. I knew that he played the guitar really well because he hung out and played the guitar, and I sat there and enjoyed, talked to him and his buddies. And it changed his behavior. It's this concept of going from living in an isolated car environment to creating neighborhoods and societies. This is a shot of the North American unit and a student coming out. What was key with this design was just about everything in that unit was recycled. So we'll show you on the door, those are all recycled yardsticks. In the interior, most of the finishes are scraps of leather, fibers, and different materials. So sustainability is not just how you live, but sustainability is the materials that you recycle and then you bring into your tiny living. There's a better shot kind of showing you the yardsticks on the floor and an American flag design that kind of shows all sorts of recycled pieces of leather strips. And on the ceiling was a North American kind of Indian-inspired motif that had custom lighting in it. So here it was, again, a nice blend, I think, between technology, it was using the Philips Hue lighting system, and so you can change colors and recycled materials to kind of add joyfulness and art to a surface that most of us ignore, which is the ceiling, which is incredibly important as you're sleeping and resting. You look up and see this beautiful design. Another key feature with these units was the idea that we grew a garden, and we had an organic garden in a parking deck. So we kept the plants in planters near the perimeter of the parking deck and used natural light to grow our vegetable garden, with small organic gardens. And the idea was, as you were getting ready to prepare your meal, you'd step out, grab some fresh vegetables, and talk to your neighbors and make a salad. And ultimately, a lot of us got to share food and knock on doors and share milk and ask for oregano from each other. Another aspect that happened was technology. So our units, instead of having windows with blinds, drapes, or curtains, we used a electrochromatic glazing system. So with using an app on your smart device, you could press a button and the clear glass would turn frosted or an opaque. And that was technology that was brand new, or pretty new, just a few years ago, and that technology has changed. Now, with the touch of a button, you can change the color of your glazing. So colors and finishes are turning into more adaptable means and giving us flexibility. So these are all sorts of other ideas and just demonstrations that the students were exploring to put into this experiment, this model of the 3 units that we have. Now, SCAD is an educational environment. It's about learning, sharing, and ultimately the purpose was to get the conversation pushed forward and thinking about it on a global scale, thinking about it on an urban planning scale, and the micro scale, the tiny little details, art and finishes. We do not have plans to build more, but what we want to do is kind of keep these going, have them on exhibit. We use them daily at the university. I was teaching a high school class just last week at Lee College, and we designed a high school curriculum booklet based on SCAD. Talk about all these different majors and different concepts, and we use the SCAD pads every week for all sorts of different events. These are some interior shots of the 3rd unit, which is called Asia, inspired by our Hong Kong campus. And this one has been renovated, and that was ultimately due to the fact that people weren't living in them, and we turned the air conditioning off a little bit too long, and we had to kind of clean things up after the summer. But so we have a new design for this that is still Asian themed, but not as eclectic as this one. This one again used technology. Hanging on the wall were nets that were kind of inspired by the fishing of specifically Hong Kong. But what would happen is you could touch the nets and it would make music. So as you touch the nets, it could actually create sounds. So again, adding that joyfulness to interiors. These are some shots of some of the interiors, exterior garden spaces that we had. And here's a shot of the vegetable garden where we grew some pretty flowers, but a lot of vegetables. This is also where there's a gray water tank there. So originally we had just tanks of water, and we salvaged and stored the gray water from the shower and from the sinks and used that to irrigate the plants, and then took away the black water. I still, when I go to SCAD and I park at the parking deck every other day or so, I park where I can see a view. It turns out that at a lot of places and a lot of city infrastructures, parking decks have some of those $1 million views. So the view from the parking deck and from the SCAD pad units was looking south and seeing downtown, midtown to downtown Atlanta. And this was space that our students were using as dorms for several months. So this is just a little example of what SCAD was doing to add to the conversation of micro tiny homes. Thank you. I think we have time for questions.
I think we're going to have questions and answers. I think yesterday they had people line up on either side, and we can walk back and forth if you have a question. Come.
I have two questions for the staff,
Okay.
gentlemen. What was the height in the height restriction in the structure, and was it on a permanent foundation or were they on trailers?
The question is, what was the height restriction inside the parking deck, and were they on a permanent foundation or a trailer?
They were built in Savannah by SCAD students with contractors supervising, and they were actually placed on trailers that Dan's firm provided or that we acquired from him. So they are sitting on wheels. We maxed out the height of the SCAD pad units, so they are 10 feet too tall. And some of the construction, especially like the roofing that you saw, and some of the detailing that was done by artists towards the very end, would be damaged if we drove them out. So, lesson learned, definitely measure your lowest speed, right?
First question, you talked about a little bit about the water system. Can you talk more about how you got the water in, and is that something that can be done in other areas, the way you did there? And then also, can you tell us the name of the glazing, the palmetto glazing?
Dan could probably talk about this in general terms too, perhaps. The water system that we used initially was just a tanked water system, and then we used the gray water, and then we had to actually remove the black or spoiled water on a weekly basis or whenever those containers maxed out. Since then, the good news is we've worked with the city of Atlanta, and we have actually gotten plumbing attached to them. So even though they're still sitting on wheels, we actually have to have utility connected to them. And unfortunately, they are not solar powered. We do have some solar collectors up on the roof, but we're actually using that to filter solar light to get deeper for some of our vegetable gardens. And in terms of electricity, we're just kind of plugged in to the grid. The electrochromatic windows, I'll have to look into the name for you. I think what we did was, we didn't even use glass because we did have to drive these units up from Savannah. So glass might crack or break based on the construction of what we did. So we used plexiglass, and we used the film over it. And it's actually, in this case, it was a film. So again, I'll kind of, let's follow up and I'll try to find out more about that. And you want to say anything else about water system?
So when they were initially doing it, like you said, they have plumbing now, which helps quite a bit, but they initially had tanks that were on wheels. And so they would roll down, and a porta potty company would come and pump it out. So it's not exactly, isn't something you'd want to replicate necessarily for your house. And obviously having plumbing is a huge advantage.
I have the privilege of being able to live in a downtown community, and in part of our city zoning laws, they have written in some stuff just for the downtown area where you can actually have small houses centered around kind of a community garden area, which is kind of half the battle as far as like the tiny house community. But the minimum requirement is like 3,000 square feet, which obviously makes that's pretty big for a tiny house. And so
You definitely got the word tiny out of that.
yeah. So I don't know if there was any ways that you would suggest approaching that, whether it's through city government or whatever, to finagle that, get exceptions or whatever to make the tiny house more feasible in that downtown kind of urban area.
I know Will has talked about this. He had a talk yesterday where they talked about starting a community and some of the struggles they had. You know, there's the variance process where you request the variance to a specific rule. sometimes what it sounded like they were doing, if you go to the permitting office directly, you may not get to someone that's necessarily going to be able to help you. So what they did for their community that they're working on, they found someone, they actually found the mayor of the town and kind of got him on board to help the process go through. They're still early on in it, but I talked to someone this weekend that actually went around to all the different counties in North or South Georgia trying to find a county that would be open to it. He just went there and talked to the planning commissioner and said, hey, this is what we want to do. What, do you think you'd be open to this? And he eventually found somebody. That's very rural Georgia. It's not your situation. So I think Will would definitely be the person to ask about that, unfortunately. Yeah. He's the one running around.
Hey, thinking about your mother and how she was in 6 years and moved back to a big house. And so my question is, how ADA compliant or ADA-like compliant can you make a tiny house?
Actually do most of the things that are in the ADA rulebook. The biggest one that we've struggled with is just the clearance for wheelchairs. Yeah, wheelchairs. You have to have a big enough area in the bathroom to be able to make a full circle, which I think is 4 or 5 feet. So that's a little bit of a challenge. But when we've had someone that was in a wheelchair contact us, and we went through the list of what we need to do, and we could meet a lot of the rules. And then the ones that we couldn't quite meet, he was like, well, actually, I don't quite need that level of clearance. I can work with something smaller. They're kind of, when they make the ADA rules, they're kind of worst case scenario, kind of, the biggest wheelchair perhaps. So he was like, I can deal with a smaller clearance in that area, but then all the other things we can take care of. So you can do quite a bit. We didn't actually build the house for him. This was just in a consultation. But it included the rails for the bathroom and everything. So there was more room dedicated to the house. Usually our bathrooms are only 3 feet deep. In this bathroom it would have been larger.
And even if you don't put in rails initially, you should at least have blocking in the walls so you can add the handrails later. Getting into the tiny houses is one of the biggest ADA issues. Whether they're on a trailer or when you're sitting on a foundation, they're going to be up 18 inches or so. So I think, again, kind of that front deck or that patio, it's important to build an appropriate deck and a ramp to have accessibility.
Hey, just the art and the reclaimed materials was gorgeous. I had the privilege of sitting and seeing the colors that we're not able to see on the screen. Can you speak more to where you guys got the materials for, all the yardsticks and the scraps and all that? That was gorgeous.
Okay. Yes, in that one, the North American unit, Marcus Kenny was the alumni. He was a recent graduate from SCAD. He went to SCAD to study, I think, film design, but he became a sculptor. And he used, almost out of, I think we're out of time, or getting close to out of time. He's a collector, and so he collected the yardsticks from hardware stores that were giving them out, and he laid them down, used them as wood flooring on the floor, and he used it as wood on the door. And it's true artisan though, because it's not just like pieces of wood putting it on the floor. Each yardstick had slightly different thickness, so he had to sand the back of each one to get everything perfectly smooth, kind of the ADA or non-tripping hazard issue. And all of the leather and fabric strips that he has, he just works with fabricators in his communities, and he lets them know, I want to use your tiny little scraps. And in Atlanta, we have the Life Cycle Building Center. We have all sorts of different resources of reusing materials. So try to check those things out. All right. I think that's it. Thank you everybody so much.